The most expensive thing in a parking lot is not always the car people are looking at. The luxury dealership looked more like a private resort than a place that sold automobiles. Glass walls reflected the afternoon sun. Perfectly polished supercars sat beneath carefully positioned lights. Every vehicle seemed designed to attract attention. That was exactly why almost nobody noticed the old sedan when it first entered the lot. Almost nobody. Ethan Walker guided the aging dark blue car toward the far edge of the parking area and shut off the engine. The vehicle looked completely out of place among rows of exotic machines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Its paint showed years of use. The body style belonged to another era. Nothing about it suggested wealth or prestige. Sophie Walker climbed out of the passenger seat holding a small backpack. At 12 years old, she had already learned something many adults never understood. Her father rarely cared what other people thought. She looked around the dealership and smiled. "This place is huge." Ethan nodded. "It is." Sophie studied the luxury cars displayed outside. "Do you think they will let us look around?" Ethan smiled faintly. That is usually how dealerships work. Together they began walking toward the main showroom. Several customers stood nearby admiring a newly delivered performance car. One man glanced at Ethan's sedan and quietly smirked before returning his attention to the expensive vehicles. Ethan did not react. He had seen those looks before. Inside the showroom, polished floors reflected every light fixture overhead. Sales staff moved confidently between clients. Large banners advertised limited production models and exclusive ownership programs. At the center of the room stood Ryan Mercer, the dealership's top sales manager. Ryan built his reputation on reading people quickly. Wealth. Status. Buying power. He believed he could identify all three within seconds. That confidence had served him well for years. When Ethan and Sophie entered, Ryan looked up briefly. His eyes moved from Ethan's work boots to Sophie's backpack. Then he glanced through the glass wall toward the old sedan outside. His expression changed immediately. Sophie noticed. Children often notice things adults missed. Ryan approached with a professional smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Good afternoon." Ethan nodded politely. "Afternoon." Ryan folded his hands. "Looking for directions?" Sophie frowned slightly. Ethan remained calm. "No." Ryan looked toward the parking lot again. "I only ask because most visitors here arrive for appointments." Several nearby salespeople overheard the conversation. One quietly smiled. Ethan simply nodded. "We are just looking around." Ryan's gaze returned to the old sedan outside. Something about the vehicle seemed strangely familiar, though he could not explain why. For a brief moment, he noticed an unusual detail near the rear quarter panel. Then the thought disappeared. He dismissed it immediately. After all, nobody drove a car like that to a dealership like this unless they were completely out of place. What Ryan did not realize was that someone else would arrive within the hour. And unlike everyone else in the building, she would notice that same detail immediately. Ryan Mercer maintained the smile for several more seconds before turning his attention to another customer. The gesture itself was subtle. The message was not. Ethan Walker recognized it immediately. He had encountered people like Ryan throughout his life. Men who measured worth by visible success. Expensive watches. Expensive houses. Expensive cars. Ethan had long ago stopped taking it personally. Sophie watched Ryan walk away and quietly folded her arms. He does not seem very friendly. Ethan glanced toward a display vehicle nearby. Everyone has different kinds of days. Sophie looked unconvinced. They continued exploring the showroom. Several customers admired a limited production sports car displayed on a rotating platform. Sales representatives discussed horsepower figures, delivery schedules, and custom options. Everywhere Ethan looked, people seemed focused on appearances. Status. Prestige. Ownership. Yet every few minutes he noticed someone glancing through the glass wall toward his old sedan parked outside. The reactions were almost identical. Curiosity. Amusement. Dismissal. Near the center of the showroom, Ryan resumed speaking with a group of clients. One of them pointed toward the parking lot. Ryan followed the gesture and laughed softly. Although Ethan could not hear the words, he could see the reaction. Several people smiled. Sophie noticed it too. "They are talking about our car." Ethan nodded. "Probably. Does that bother you?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Not really." Sophie looked outside. "I like our car." A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. "So do I." The answer seemed to satisfy her. Meanwhile, Ryan's confidence continued growing. The dealership was hosting an exclusive event later that afternoon. Important clients were expected to arrive. Industry executives. Business owners. Investors. Everything needed to look perfect. To Ryan, the old sedan sitting among exotic vehicles looked like a mistake. Eventually he walked back toward Ethan. "Sir, I hope you do not mind me asking." Ethan looked up. "Go ahead." Ryan gestured toward the parking lot. "That vehicle outside. Is it yours?" "Yes." Ryan nodded slowly. "Interesting choice for a place like this." Several nearby customers overheard the comment. One smiled knowingly. Another glanced toward the sedan and quietly shook his head. Ethan remained calm. "It gets us where we need to go." Ryan chuckled. "I suppose that is one way to look at it." Sophie lowered her eyes. She was old enough to understand when someone was being polite and when someone was being dismissive. Ethan noticed but said nothing. Ryan continued. "Most people who attend events here appreciate automotive excellence." Ethan looked toward the old sedan through the showroom glass. "That seems reasonable." Ryan smiled. "Then I am surprised you drove that." The comment generated a few quiet laughs from nearby guests. Ethan simply nodded once. No defense. No explanation. No argument. That response somehow disappointed Ryan. He had expected embarrassment. Instead he received complete calm. Before he could say anything else, a man standing near the entrance suddenly paused and stared toward the parking lot. He was an engineer employed by one of the manufacturers represented at the event. His attention locked onto the sedan. More specifically, onto a small detail hidden near the rear section of the vehicle. His expression changed immediately. Confusion appeared first. Then curiosity. Then something else. Recognition. For several moments he simply stood there staring. Because he had just noticed something that absolutely should not have existed on an ordinary old car. The engineer could not take his eyes off the sedan. While everyone else saw an aging car parked among luxury vehicles, he saw something completely different. He slowly walked toward the showroom windows and leaned closer. The unusual detail near the rear section was small enough that most people would never notice it. Yet for someone with years of automotive engineering experience, it stood out immediately. Ryan Mercer followed his gaze. "Everything okay?" The engineer did not answer right away. Instead, he continued studying the vehicle. Finally he spoke. "That cannot be original." Ryan frowned. "What?" The engineer pointed through the glass. "That component." Ryan squinted. "Looks like an old car to me." Several people nearby laughed softly. The engineer did not. His expression remained serious. Ethan Walker glanced toward the window but said nothing. Sophie noticed him watching the engineer. "Do you know what he sees?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe." That answer only increased her curiosity. Outside, sunlight reflected across the sedan's worn paint. The vehicle looked completely ordinary from a distance. Yet the engineer continued staring. Something about the proportions seemed unusual. Not obvious. Just different. As though the car had been built according to a set of rules nobody else understood. Eventually he walked outside for a closer look. Ryan watched with amusement. "I think he is giving your car more attention than any vehicle here." Ethan nodded politely. "That happens sometimes." Ryan laughed. "I cannot imagine why." Again, Ethan offered no explanation. Minutes passed. More guests arrived for the afternoon event. Luxury vehicles rolled into the lot one after another. Expensive engines echoed across the property. Cameras flashed. Conversations filled the air. Yet every few moments someone noticed the engineer circling the old sedan. The behavior seemed increasingly strange. He examined wheel placement, body lines, airflow channels hidden beneath seemingly ordinary panels. At one point he crouched beside the vehicle and simply stared. Inside the showroom, curiosity slowly spread. Another automotive specialist eventually joined him. Then another. Ryan's confidence began slipping slightly. He could not understand what attracted so much attention to a car that looked ready for retirement. Through it all, Ethan remained calm. Sophie sat beside him near a display vehicle and watched the growing crowd outside. "People keep looking at our car." Ethan nodded. "They do." "Why?" Ethan considered the question. "Sometimes people notice things at different speeds." Sophie smiled. "That sounds like something you would say." Before Ethan could respond, activity near the dealership entrance suddenly changed. Staff members straightened their posture. Event coordinators moved into position. Several guests turned toward the front doors. A black executive vehicle had just arrived. Ryan immediately adjusted his jacket. Excitement appeared across the showroom. One of the most influential automotive executives in the country was attending the event. Charlotte Hayes, Chief Executive Officer of one of the largest performance vehicle manufacturers in America. As the doors opened and Charlotte entered the building, conversations shifted instantly. Cameras followed her. Executives approached to greet her. Yet before she acknowledged anyone, her eyes moved across the showroom windows toward the parking lot outside. Then she stopped walking completely. Because among dozens of luxury vehicles, one old sedan had just captured her full attention. Charlotte Hayes rarely stopped walking when she entered a room. Her schedule was measured in minutes. Executives waited weeks for meetings. Investors adjusted calendars to accommodate her availability. Yet the moment she stepped inside the luxury dealership, she froze. Her eyes remained fixed on the parking lot beyond the glass walls. More specifically, on the aging dark blue sedan parked near the far edge of the property. Conversations around her continued for several seconds before people realized she was no longer moving. Ryan Mercer immediately approached. "Charlotte, welcome. We are honored to have you here today." Charlotte nodded politely but barely seemed to hear him. Her attention remained outside. "Whose car is that?" The question caught Ryan off guard. He glanced through the window. "That?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes." Ryan laughed softly. "Just an old sedan. One of our visitors drove it here." Charlotte continued staring. The engineer outside was still examining the vehicle. Another specialist had joined him. Neither appeared interested in any of the luxury cars surrounding them. Charlotte's expression became more serious. Interesting. Ryan smiled confidently. Not really. Trust me. Charlotte finally turned toward him. I never trust anyone who says trust me. The response generated a few nervous laughs. Ryan quickly changed the subject and began discussing the event schedule. Charlotte listened for a moment before looking back toward the parking lot. Something about the vehicle felt familiar. Not the model itself. The proportions. The design philosophy. Certain decisions hidden beneath an intentionally ordinary appearance. She had seen that kind of thinking before. Years ago. Among engineers who viewed automobiles differently than everyone else. Across the showroom, Ethan Walker noticed the arrival but remained seated. Sophie looked toward the crowd forming around Charlotte. She seems important. Ethan smiled slightly. She probably is. Sophie followed his gaze. Do you know her? Ethan considered the question. Not really. That answer was technically true. Meanwhile, Charlotte finally began walking again. To everyone's surprise, she did not head toward the event stage. She did not inspect the newest vehicles. She walked directly toward the showroom windows. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Ryan followed closely behind. Outside, the engineers examining the sedan noticed her approaching. One immediately stepped aside. Charlotte stopped a few feet from the glass and studied the vehicle carefully. Her eyes moved from the wheel. Placement to the body lines. Then to several subtle modifications hidden in plain sight. The longer she looked, the more curious she became. Who owns it? She asked. Ryan pointed toward Ethan. That gentleman. Charlotte followed his gesture. For the first time, her attention shifted from the car to the man sitting quietly beside his daughter. Ethan met her gaze briefly. Then returned his attention to Sophie. No attempt to impress. No effort to attract notice. Charlotte found that unusual. Most people reacted differently when powerful individuals entered a room. Before Ryan could continue speaking, Charlotte started walking toward Ethan. The showroom gradually became silent. Customers stopped talking. Employees paused mid-conversation. Even Sophie noticed the change. Dad, she whispered. Ethan looked up. Charlotte stopped directly in front of him. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she glanced toward the old sedan outside. Finally she asked a single question. Who built that car? The entire showroom went completely silent. The question seemed simple. Yet the effect was immediate. Every conversation inside the showroom stopped. Sales representatives fell silent. Customers turned toward Ethan Walker. Even Ryan Mercer looked confused. He had expected Charlotte Hayes to ask about performance figures, investment opportunities, or one of the flagship vehicles displayed throughout the dealership. Instead she wanted to know who built an old sedan. Ethan looked at Charlotte for a moment. Then he answered in the same calm tone he had used all afternoon. I did. Nobody reacted at first. The statement sounded too ordinary. Too simple. Then several people processed what he had actually said. Charlotte nodded slowly. As though she had just confirmed something she already suspected. Ryan laughed softly. You built it? Ethan nodded once. Yes. Ryan looked toward the parking lot and smiled. Personally? Yes. The disbelief in Ryan's voice was obvious. To him, the answer sounded ridiculous. Yet Charlotte did not seem surprised at all. Instead she continued studying Ethan carefully. How long ago? Ethan thought for a moment. About 14 years. Charlotte nodded again. Around them, curiosity continued growing. The engineers outside were now openly examining the vehicle. One of them approached the showroom entrance carrying a tablet. He stopped beside Charlotte and quietly showed her several photographs he had just taken. Her eyes moved across the images. Then her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for another engineer nearby to notice. "What is it?" he asked. Charlotte handed him the tablet. Seconds later, his eyes widened. Ryan stepped closer. "Would someone mind explaining what is happening?" Nobody answered immediately. The second engineer continued scrolling through photographs. Hidden structural modifications. Unusual airflow management solutions. Hand-built mechanical systems integrated into locations where they should not have fit. None of it made sense. Not because the work was poor. Because it was exceptional. Eventually one engineer looked directly at Ethan. "This is not a modified production vehicle." Ethan shook his head. "No." The engineer glanced back toward the sedan. "Then what is it?" Ethan smiled faintly. "A project." Sophie sat quietly beside her father, trying not to smile. She had heard that answer before. Many times. Every time someone asked about the car, Ethan called it a project. Never more than that. Meanwhile, Ryan's confidence continued fading. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. The same people who ignored the sedan earlier were now staring at it with growing respect. Charlotte finally spoke again. "May we take a closer look?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Within minutes a crowd had gathered around the vehicle outside. Luxury sports cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sat forgotten nearby. Cameras that had been focused on flagship models now pointed toward the aging sedan. Engineers moved around it carefully. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. Nothing about the vehicle matched expectations. Every solution seemed unconventional. Every component suggested extraordinary craftsmanship hidden beneath complete simplicity. Ryan stood quietly at the edge of the crowd watching everything unfold. Earlier he had seen an old car driven by a man he assumed did not belong there. Now some of the most respected automotive experts in the country were examining that same vehicle as though it were a museum piece. And for the first time all afternoon, Ryan began wondering whether he had made a very expensive mistake. The crowd around the sedan continued growing. What began as curiosity had become something else entirely. Respect. Engineers moved carefully from one section of the vehicle to another, documenting details and exchanging observations in increasingly serious tones. Charlotte Hayes listened quietly as they spoke. Every few minutes someone discovered another feature hidden beneath the car's ordinary appearance. None of them could understand why such advanced work had been concealed inside a machine that looked completely forgettable. Ethan Walker stood nearby with Sophie. He answered questions when asked but never volunteered additional information. The more attention the vehicle received, the more reserved he seemed to become. That alone impressed Charlotte. Most builders would have enjoyed the recognition. Ethan appeared indifferent to it. One engineer finally looked up from beneath the rear section of the car. "This suspension geometry should not work." Another engineer nodded. "That is what I thought too." The first engineer shook his head. "But it does work." A third specialist joined the discussion. "Not only does it work, it solves a problem manufacturers have struggled with for years." The comments spread through the crowd. More people gathered. Ryan Mercer remained near the back, watching the entire scene unfold. Earlier he had mocked the vehicle openly. Now some of the smartest automotive minds in attendance were treating it like a technical breakthrough. The contrast made him increasingly uncomfortable. Charlotte eventually approached the driver's side door. "May I?" Ethan nodded. She opened the door and looked inside. The cabin appeared simple at first glance. Then she noticed the details. Custom instrumentation. Hand-built controls. Materials chosen for function rather than appearance. Every decision reflected a level of engineering discipline rarely seen even in professional prototype programs. Charlotte slowly smiled. She had seen this kind of work only a handful of times in her career. It always came from the same type of person. Someone more interested in solving problems than receiving credit. One of the engineers suddenly looked toward Ethan. Why was this never presented publicly? Ethan shrugged slightly. That was never the goal. The answer surprised several people. Another engineer asked, then why build it? Ethan glanced toward Sophie. Because I wanted to. The simplicity of the response silenced the group. Charlotte noticed Sophie's reaction. The girl was smiling. Not because people were finally praising the car. Because none of this seemed surprising to her. She had known all along. Meanwhile, another engineer had begun comparing photographs of the sedan against archived industry records. At first he searched out of curiosity. Then his expression changed. He looked again. Then a third time. Finally he stood up abruptly. Charlotte. The seriousness in his voice immediately attracted attention. Charlotte turned. What is it? The engineer walked over holding a tablet. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. I think I know where some of these design solutions came from. Charlotte accepted the tablet and reviewed the information. The moment she saw the images, her expression changed. Old development records. Experimental concepts. Prototype systems that had once been considered revolutionary. Many had disappeared before reaching production. Yet the design language was unmistakable. Charlotte slowly lifted her eyes toward Ethan. Around them, conversations faded once again. Because the engineer had just uncovered something far more significant than a remarkable car. He had found the first clue leading to the identity of the man who built it. The atmosphere around the sedan had changed completely. Earlier, people laughed when they looked at it. Now nobody laughed at all. Engineers continued comparing photographs, technical archives, and design records. Every new discovery pointed toward the same conclusion. The car was not merely unusual. It represented ideas that had been years ahead of their time. Charlotte Hayes stood beside the vehicle, reviewing the material displayed on the tablet. The more she examined it, the more certain she became. She had encountered these concepts before. Long ago. During the early years of her career, when she was still learning from some of the industry's most respected innovators. One of the engineers finally looked up. Charlotte, you remember Project Horizon? Several older professionals immediately recognized the name. Younger engineers did not. Charlotte nodded slowly. Of course. Project Horizon had become almost legendary in certain automotive circles. Years earlier, it introduced a collection of revolutionary engineering concepts that influenced countless future designs. Yet the project itself vanished before reaching public production. Over time, stories about it became industry folklore. The engineer pointed toward the sedan. Some of these solutions came directly from that program. Silence followed. Several people stared at Ethan Walker. Ryan Mercer felt his stomach tighten. He had heard the name before. Every serious automotive professional had. The engineer continued scrolling through archived documents. Then he stopped. A personnel file appeared on the screen. The crowd leaned closer. Charlotte looked at the information for several seconds. Then she slowly exhaled. The answer was sitting directly in front of her. Ethan noticed the reaction but remained calm. Sophie glanced between the adults. She did not understand the technical discussion. She only understood that people were finally seeing something she had always known. Her father was different. The engineer looked at Ethan. You were part of Horizon. Ethan nodded once. Yes. The crowd became even quieter. Part of it? Another engineer asked. Ethan smiled faintly. Something like that. Charlotte continued reviewing the file. Then she looked up. Not part of it. Her voice carried across the gathering. You let it. Several people froze. Ryan blinked. He thought he had misunderstood. Charlotte turned the tablet toward the nearest engineers. The archived records confirmed it. Ethan Walker. Lead design architect. Chief systems developer. Primary creator behind many of the concepts that later shaped an entire generation of performance vehicles. Nobody spoke for several moments. The revelation landed harder than anyone expected. Ryan looked from the tablet to Ethan and back again. The man he had mocked all afternoon was not an amateur enthusiast. He was one of the innovators whose work had influenced the very cars displayed throughout the dealership. Charlotte studied Ethan carefully. You disappeared. Ethan nodded. I suppose I did. People spent years wondering where you went. Ethan glanced toward Sophie. I was busy. The answer seemed almost unbelievable. Yet somehow it fit perfectly. Charlotte followed his gaze toward Sophie and immediately understood. Some people spend their lives chasing recognition. Others walk away from it when something more important appears. Around them, the crowd remained silent. The mystery had finally been solved. Yet for Ryan Mercer, a different realization was only beginning. Because he now understood exactly who he had been laughing at. And he knew everyone else understood it too. Ryan Mercer wished the ground would open beneath him. Every conversation happening around the sedan felt like a reminder of his mistake. Just hours earlier, he had treated Ethan Walker as someone who did not belong at the dealership. Now engineers, executives, and industry leaders surrounded the man with genuine admiration. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Yet Ethan himself seemed completely unaffected by the attention. He stood beside Sophie exactly as he had all afternoon. Calm. Relaxed. Uninterested in proving anything to anyone. That somehow made the situation even worse for Ryan. Charlotte Hayes continued speaking with several engineers while reviewing additional archive records. More details emerged with every passing minute. Patents. Design breakthroughs. Experimental systems that influenced entire product categories. Ethan's contributions appeared throughout the industry's history like invisible fingerprints. One engineer shook his head in disbelief. Half the technologies we use today started with concepts from Horizon. Another nodded. And he built this car himself. Several guests turned back toward the sedan. Earlier they saw an old vehicle. Now they saw a masterpiece hidden beneath simplicity. Ryan finally stepped forward. The decision clearly cost him something. Public confidence came naturally to him. Public humility did not. He stopped a few feet from Ethan. For a moment he struggled to find the right words. Everyone nearby noticed. Sophie looked up quietly. Charlotte turned her attention toward the exchange. Finally Ryan spoke. I owe you an apology. The crowd became silent again. Ethan looked at him calmly. Ryan continued. I made assumptions I should not have made. The admission sounded genuine. I judged you before I knew anything about you. Ethan nodded slightly. Not approving. Not condemning. Simply listening. Ryan glanced toward the sedan. And I completely misunderstood that car. A few people smiled. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. It happens. The answer surprised Ryan. No anger. No satisfaction. No desire for revenge. Just a simple statement. Somehow that response made the apology feel more meaningful. Charlotte watched carefully. She had seen powerful people handle public recognition poorly. She had seen successful people enjoy watching others fail. Ethan did neither. He carried himself exactly the same before the reveal as after it. That quality impressed her more than any technical achievement. A few moments later, one of the engineers asked Ethan whether he would consider displaying the sedan at an upcoming automotive innovation conference. Another asked whether he would participate in a technical panel discussion. A third suggested publishing a paper documenting several of the vehicle's engineering solutions. Ethan listened politely. Then he smiled. I appreciate the interest. Everyone waited. But I think I will pass. Several people laughed softly. The answer felt perfectly consistent with everything they had learned about him. Charlotte looked toward Sophie. What do you think about all this? Sophie smiled. It is kind of funny. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Why? Sophie looked at the crowd surrounding the sedan. Because nobody cared about the car until somebody important noticed it. The statement landed harder than anyone expected. Several people exchanged embarrassed looks. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. Charlotte smiled. The child had summarized the entire afternoon with perfect accuracy. And for the first time since Ethan arrived, the people around him were no longer looking at the car. They were thinking about themselves. The crowd remained around the sedan for another hour, but the mood had changed completely. The excitement was still there. The curiosity remained. Yet something deeper had taken its place. Respect. Not only for the car. For the man who built it. Engineers continued asking questions. Executives requested meetings. Industry professionals offered introductions and opportunities. Ethan Walker listened politely to every conversation. Then declined almost every offer. The responses were always respectful. Always brief. Always final. Eventually the event began winding down. Guests departed. Cameras disappeared. Luxury vehicles rolled out of the parking lot one by one. The dealership slowly returned to normal. Charlotte Hayes stood beside the sedan as the evening sun settled lower across the city. You know, she said, there are companies that would compete for years to hire someone with your background. Ethan smiled faintly. I know. Charlotte looked at him. You are not interested? Ethan glanced toward Sophie, who was sitting on a nearby bench finishing a snack. I already have the job I want. Charlotte followed his gaze and smiled. The answer explained everything. Ryan Mercer approached one final time. This time there was no sales pitch. No confidence. No performance. Just honesty. Thank you for accepting my apology. Ethan nodded. Everyone gets things wrong sometimes. Ryan laughed quietly. I was especially talented today. Even Ethan smiled at that. For the first time all afternoon, the tension between them disappeared. Nearby, Sophie stood and walked over. Dad, are we leaving? Ethan nodded. Pretty soon. Charlotte looked at the old sedan once more. What are you going to do with it? Ethan opened the driver's door. Drive it home. Several engineers laughed. One shook his head. A machine like that belongs in a museum. Ethan considered the statement. Then he looked at Sophie. It gets her to school every morning. Nobody had a response to that. Because somehow it felt more important than any museum. More important than any award. More important than any public recognition. Ethan had built something extraordinary. Yet he never treated it as a trophy. To him, it remained what it had always been. A car. A project. A useful part of life. As the parking lot continued emptying, Sophie climbed into the passenger seat. Ethan settled behind the wheel. The engine started with a smooth, confident sound that several engineers immediately turned to hear. Charlotte stepped back and folded her arms. "It was an honor meeting you." Ethan nodded. "You too." Then he pulled away from the dealership. No dramatic speech. No celebration. No final attempt to impress anyone. The sedan simply rolled toward the exit and disappeared into the evening traffic. Charlotte watched until it was gone. Ryan stood beside her in silence. Finally he spoke. "I thought I was looking at an old car." Charlotte smiled. "Most people did." Ryan shook his head slowly. "How did you know?" Charlotte looked toward the road where the sedan had vanished. "Because truly exceptional work usually hides in plain sight." Miles away, Sophie looked out the window as the city lights passed by. "Today was weird." Ethan laughed softly. "A little." Sophie smiled. "I still liked our car before everyone else did." Ethan glanced at her and smiled. "That is because you knew what it was worth." Sophie nodded proudly. Outside, the city continued moving. Inside the old sedan, nothing had really changed. And that was exactly the point.